Okay, so today we're going to talk about chapter 22, which is the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system has basically three different functions. The first function is that it produces, maintains, and distributes lymphocytes. So lymphocytes are the main cells of the lymphatic system. And so the lymphatic system, like I said, will produce, maintain, and distribute these cells. These cells, we're going to find out, they're produced and stored in the spleen, the thymus, and the bone marrow. So we'll be looking into those lymphocytes. The second thing that it does, the lymphatic system returns fluids to the blood. Fluids that are in the interstitial fluid. So we're going to take a look at that and see how that works. And so since it does this, it also returns solutes too, but because it does this, it is able to help to maintain blood volume. And then third, we're going to look in this chapter and see how, as well as returning fluid to the blood, the lymphatic system uses its fluid to distribute hormones. As well as nutrients and waste products. Let's talk about the components of the lymphatic system. So first of all, we have this fluid that I've been talking about that's called lymph. And so lymph is a fluid. It's a little similar to interstitial fluid, so we'll talk about that. Lymph flows in these blood vessels that we call lymphatic vessels. So we are going to look at that. This is just a network of vessels. The cells inside these lymphatic vessels that float around in this lymph are called lymphocytes. Those are the main cells of the lymphatic system. Those are the specialized cells. And then we have lymphatic tissues or lymphoid tissues. And we have lymphoid organs. So lymphoid organs are going to be covered by a capsule. Whereas the tissues are not. So the lymphocytes are the dominant cells. And they are going to respond to pathogens. So they respond to the presence of pathogens. And these pathogens are invading the body and intending to do harm to the body. They also respond to abnormal body cells. So for instance, if one of your cells is infected, or if one of your cells has cancer, the lymphocytes are going to respond to those. They also respond to foreign proteins, things that just don't look quite normal. And so these are toxins maybe that are secreted by cells. So like bacteria. So not only do they respond to the pathogens, and pathogens can be bacteria or viruses or parasites. Okay, they can be any of these things, but they can also respond to the toxins that are being secreted by those bacteria. So when the lymphocytes respond, we call this the immune response. And this is a very specific defense against a specific pathogen. For example, against a specific bacteria, such as maybe Staph aureus, Staphylococcus aureus. Immunity is the ability of your body to resist the infection and the disease. So basically to resist the invasion or the disease. So here's a picture of the lymphatic system and the different components. And so we can see some things I want to show you. All these little vessels in here, these little green lines that you're seeing, those are the lymphatic vessels. And the lymphatic vessels tend to run right alongside arteries and veins, and they begin down somewhere in the periphery. So they start down in the periphery and then they work their way back up, and then they drain into one of the major vessels, and from there they drain up towards the heart, and then they will end up dumping their fluids into the subclavian veins. So we're going to look at that. This is different than, remember, the arteries and the veins. So the arteries and veins, and you can't see the heart in here, but the heart would be in here. The arteries carry blood away from the heart, and they'll carry it all the way down to the tissues, and then they become capillaries, and they distribute the oxygen and nutrients, and then the blood loops back around through the veins, and then the veins come back up to the right side of the heart. Right, so that is a systemic circuit. We see that it never, it doesn't end. It doesn't have an ending like the lymphatics do. So the lymphatics don't have this loop. Instead, they start in the periphery. So they'll start in the periphery, and they will work their way back up, and then they will dump into the subclavian vessels near the heart. So inside those blood vessels is a fluid that's called lymph. And in that lymph will be those cells that we call the lymphocytes. So there's lymphoid tissues then, these lymphoid tissues, such as tonsils, those are tissues, and the thymus, that's a lymphatic gland, that's a tissue. We also have the spleen, that's a lymphatic organ. And then there are some lymphatic tissues in the digestive and respiratory and urinary and reproductive tracts, and we call that MALT, or mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. And then we have these lymph nodes. So the lymph nodes are also lymphatic tissues, and they aggregate or they cluster in certain areas of the body. So then we call them by wherever they are aggregating. So for instance, the cervical lymph nodes we find in the cervical area. There's also there's pelvic lymph nodes, lumbar lymph nodes. We want you to also know the inguinal lymph nodes. Those will be in the inguinal area. And then there's the axillary lymph nodes, and the axillary lymph nodes are going to be in the armpit area. So those are some of the ones that we want you to be aware of. Now, all of those smaller lymphatic vessels are going to merge together into specific major lymph vessels, and we're going to look at those. The cisterna chyli is an expanded area where all of the lower extremity lymphatic vessels drain into, and then the cisterna chyli drains into the thoracic duct. And then there's also the right lymphatic duct. So we're going to take a look at these three structures, so you can see how the fluid comes back to the subclavian veins. The picture down here that you see is the lymphocytes. So lymphocytes have a very distinct look to them. The cells have a very large nucleus, and there is very little cytoplasm outside the nucleus. So this whole nucleus is taking up the inside of the cell, and then there's very little there's very little cytoplasm then on the outside of the cell. So that would be where the cytoplasm is, and there's just not very much cytoplasm. These pictures are sort of describing the lymphatic vessels. So remember, the lymphatic vessels, they start at an end, right? Just like that. So they start at an end, and we don't see that with blood vessels. With blood vessels, we see the arteries become arterioles, the arterioles become capillaries, the capillaries become venules, the venules become veins, and they all start and end at the heart. The lymphatic vessels, however, they start in the periphery, and then they work their way up back towards the heart. So I'm going to show you that. What is happening here, if you remember, in the capillaries, fluid, because of hydrostatic pressure, gets pushed out into the interstitial space, and then the fluid, 15% of it will move into the lymphatic vessel, and 85% of it will move into the capillaries, back into the capillaries. So then 15% of the fluid will travel through this lymphatic vessel and make its way back up to the heart. So we see a picture over here. This is the lymphatic capillary, so this is the very end of the lymphatic vessel. And so fluid in the interstitial fluid will flow into the lymphatic vessel, and once it's in the lymphatic vessels, it's then called lymph. And the lymph then will flow into larger vessels and will flow back to the heart. So let me kind of show you that. Here's the heart. There's the left side of the heart, and there's the right side of the heart, okay? And then we know we have these veins that are called the subclavian veins. So we have the subclavian, we have the right subclavian vein, and we have the left subclavian vein. Now, if you remember, these veins are going to drain into their respective brachiocephalic veins. So there's other blood vessels draining in here, and then that becomes the brachiocephalic vein. So we have the brachiocephalic vein on the left, and then we have the brachiocephalic vein on the right. So here's those other veins. Remember what those are? Internal jugular, vertebral vein, external jugular, right? So they're draining into, and then this is the subclavian, and this is the right brachiocephalic vein. And then these two brachiocephalic veins drain into what we call the superior vena cava, and the superior vena cava then drains into the right atrium. All right, so we have these lymphatic vessels that are going to drain into the subclavian veins. And there's two major lymphatic vessels. One of them drains into the right side. Okay, so that lymphatic vessel is going to be called the right lymphatic duct. And the other one drains into the left subclavian vein, and that one is called the thoracic duct. Now the thoracic duct goes all the way down the chest cavity, and then in the abdominal area, it expands to become a cistern where it's collecting fluids, and this is called the cisterna chyli. Okay, so all these other lymphatic vessels are draining into each one of these, right? There's all sorts of vessels draining into these. So the cisterna chyli is collecting fluid from the abdominopelvic area and the lower extremity or the legs. Where's the right lymphatic duct? And so this is actually, we're going to look at this. The cisterna chyli is collecting from both sides of the body. Also draining into the thoracic duct is the left head and thoracic cavity. And the right lymphatic duct, all that's draining into there is a much smaller portion. It is the right side of the head and the right arm and the right side of the thoracic cavity. So let's look at a picture of that. So here is the distribution and fluid and where it drains into. So if we were looking at that picture that I had, so here's your heart right about in this area. There's the right side of the heart and there's the left side of the heart. So there's the right subclavian, there's the left subclavian. So what we have is that thoracic duct, which is going to make its way. There's a cisterna chyli down here, and then the thoracic duct comes up and it drains into that left subclavian vein. So that is the left subclavian vein. And then that's the cisterna chyli. And that's the thoracic duct. So look at how much of the body is being drained by this thoracic duct, right? So we have all of this dark green area. So the entire abdominal pelvic, both legs, the left arm, the left thoracic cavity, and the left side of the head. All of that is being drained into the thoracic duct, which then drains into the left subclavian vein. The right lymphatic duct then is only draining a small amount, a small area of the body, and so that duct comes up and it drains right into that right subclavian vein. So that's the right subclavian vein. That's receiving the fluid from the right lymphatic duct. That's the right lymphatic duct. So we can see that the right lymphatic duct is draining the right side of the head, the right arm, and the right thoracic cavity. So here's a picture that you might see on the lab exam. And here you can see the cisterna chyli down at the bottom. So that's collecting fluid. And then you can see how the thoracic duct then leads up away from the cisterna chyli. And that dumps then into that left subclavian vein. So this is the left subclavian vein, and that drains into the left brachiocephalic vein. Over on the other side then, you can see here is that right lymphatic duct draining into the right subclavian vein. The right subclavian vein is draining into the right brachiocephalic vein, and those brachiocephalic veins come together then to form that superior vena cava. Right, so this is the superior vena cava. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the lymphocytes. So lymphocytes, as you remember, those are one of the leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells. So this is one of the white blood cell types. And they account for about 20 to 30% of all of the white blood cells. There's three types of lymphocytes. First, we have the T cells. The T cells they make up about 80% of the lymphocytes, and we say that they are thymus dependent. So that's where the T comes from. T stands for thymus. That means they are dependent on the thymus. All of these lymphocytes, by the way, they are made in the bone marrow. So they're made in the red bone marrow. But the T lymphocytes, we say, are thymus dependent because they have to, they mature in the thymus. So even though they're made in the red bone marrow, they have to travel to the thymus in order to become mature, and then they're released out into the bloodstream. Then we have the B cells. And the B cells, we can say, are bone marrow derived. This is not why we call them B cells. We call them B cells because of the organ in the bird that they were first discovered in. That bird began with the letter B. But we're going to just use B for bone marrow derived. And so bone marrow derived means that they are produced and they mature in the bone marrow. So they don't have to travel to a different organ in order to mature. They make up 10 to 15% of the lymphocytes. Then finally we have the natural killer cells, NK cells, or natural killer cells. These natural killer cells make up 5 to 10% of the circulating lymphocytes, and they attack any foreign cells. They'll also attack body cells that are infected. With viruses. And they'll also attack cancer cells. So they're not very specific. They are just going to attack anything basically that looks dangerous and abnormal. And so we call these natural killer cells, we say that they're part of immunological surveillance. Surveillance meaning they just float around looking for anything that looks abnormal. And then when it looks abnormal, they shoot little perforins out at them. Perforins are little chemicals that shoot like bullets, and it makes holes in the membranes of these other cells and makes them burst. So the T cells and the B cells, they're involved in specific immunity, which means they're going to be, there's going to be very specific T cells that attack specific pathogens, and there's specific B cells that attack specific pathogens. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But the ratio of the B cells to the T cells is, it varies with the tissue or the organ. So this, the ratio of B cells to T cells varies. They're not going to be the same ratio in every single tissue. We'll talk about the differences between the T cells and B cells, at least a couple of differences before we end this chapter. The T cells are basically quicker. So what that means is they start producing immunity faster than the B cells do. The production of lymphocytes is called lymphopoiesis. So if you remember again, poiesis means the production of, so lympho means lymphocytes. So this is another name for lymphocyte production. And like I said, it occurs in the bone marrow. And there are some that are also produced in the peripheral, like lymphoid tissue. And as well, like we said, with the T cells in the thymus. Let's talk about the process of lymphopoiesis. We start with a hemocytoblast. This is in the bone marrow, the red bone marrow. Remember where red bone marrow is found. It's found in flat bones. It's found in the proximal end of long bones. It's found in irregular bones like the vertebrae. So those are just a few locations to name a few. All right, so the hemocytoblasts are in the red bone marrow, and then the hemocytoblast can produce either myeloid stem cells or they can produce lymphoid stem cells. So the lymphoid stem cells, they are going to go on to produce two different types of cells. If they remain in the bone marrow, one half will remain in the bone marrow. And when they remain in the bone marrow, they will either become the natural killer cells or the B cells. The other group of lymphoid stem cells will travel to the thymus. And in the thymus, then, that lymphoid stem cell will become the T cells. These natural killer cells, they are going to migrate then out of the red bone marrow, and they will start migrating through the entire body. And they'll just be looking for anything that looks abnormal. The B cells, they are going to move into areas like the lymph nodes and the spleen and other lymphoid tissues, and that's where they will stay. The T cells will also move into the blood and into the lymph nodes and in other lymphatic tissues of the body. If you remember when we talked about the myeloid stem cells, on the other hand, they can become red blood cells, they can become platelets, or they can become the other white blood cells, just not lymphocytes. So they can become neutrophils, monocytes, eosinophils, or basophils. Let's talk a little bit about lymphoid tissues. So lymphoid tissues are connective tissue that is dominated by lymphocytes. So one such type of lymphoid tissue are lymphoid nodules. These nodules are areas of areolar tissue that are packed with those lymphocytes. We find these lymphoid nodules deep in the epithelia, in the lining of the GI tract and the respiratory tract. Another type of lymphoid tissue are the tonsils. And the tonsils are nodules in the walls of the pharynx. So the pharynx, remember, that's your throat. And they guard the entrance to the digestive and the respiratory tract. And so why do you think the digestive and the respiratory tract are so important? If you hear anything in the news, they're always telling you how bacteria and viruses, that's how they get into your body most of the time. They come in through, your mouth, if you're touching your mouth, if you're eating something, if you're, you're coming in contact with some type of pathogen in your, through your mouth or your nasal cavity for the respiratory tract. Here's a picture of your tonsils, and you'll have this on your lab diagram. You have 3 different types of tonsils. There's the pharyngeal tonsil, the palatine tonsil, and then the lingual tonsil. You're seeing only the left side, but there's only one pharyngeal tonsil, and a lot of times we call that the adenoids. So that's your adenoid tonsil. There are two palatine tonsils, so you're only seeing the left palatine tonsil, and there are two lingual tonsils, so you're only seeing the left lingual tonsil. You will see this picture in your lab exam for chapter 22. Then we have what are called lymphoid organs. Lymphoid organs are called organs and not tissues because they have capsules around them. So one type of lymphoid organ is the lymph nodes. These are small and oval lymphoid organs that are covered by a fibrous capsule. The lymph node function, at least what they do is they remove antigens, so at least 99% of antigens are removed by these lymph nodes. So you're probably saying, well, what are antigens? Well, we've heard of antigens before. We heard about them on your red blood cells, right? Remember the A and the O antigens? So there's your red blood cell. And we said that if we have the B antigen, that would be a person that's type B. Well, all cells actually have these antigens. So like a little bacteria, and a little bacteria is going to have an antigen on its surface. It's not going to look like the B antigen, of course. It's its own antigen. And so these antigens, along with the pathogens that are carrying them or that they belong to, have to be removed. So 99% of those antigens will be removed by the lymph nodes. So the structure of these lymph nodes is such that you have one vessel leaving the lymph node, and we call that the efferent vessel. And then here's the lymph node. And then we have several of these vessels bringing fluid into the lymph node. And those are called the afferent vessels. So we have fluid being brought into the lymph nodes. So this fluid's being brought into the lymph node. And inside the lymph node, there are a number of things in here. We have fixed macrophages. So we know what macrophages do. They engulf things, right? There's also the T cells are in here, and there's also B cells in here. So the macrophages, the T cells, and the B cells are going to come in contact with this fluid. So if there's any of these antigens floating around, or if there's any of these bacteria floating around, then the macrophages, the T cells, and the B cells are going to be able to respond to that and create an immune response. When there's an infection in your body, the T cells and the B cells will start to multiply, and there will become more and more T cells and B cells until this lymphocyte swells and gets much bigger than its normal size. When this happens, you can actually palpate the lymph nodes. When you have an infection. So let's just take a look at a picture of this. So here's a child, and this would be one of the cervical lymph nodes. And you can see how it's swollen, and you would be able to palpate that as well. You'd be able to feel that, and you could tell that that was a swollen lymph node. The next lymphoid organ is the thymus. The thymus is located in the mediastinum. So again, here's the right lung, here's the left lung, here's the heart, and then up in this area, up in, up in here, that is called the mediastinum. So right above your heart, right in front of those major blood vessels, is this lymphatic organ. This is the site of T cell maturation. So this is where T cells mature. The thymus is going to be large during infancy because this is when the most amount of different types of T cells are going to be produced. But then they start to shrink in adulthood, because by the time you've reached adulthood, you've come in contact with just about all of the pathogens that you'll be coming in contact with for the remainder of your life if you stay in that region of the world. So the T cells are produced in the red bone marrow, and then the stem cells are transported to the thymus, and that's where they mature, and then they are going to migrate into the bloodstream then. This is showing a picture of the thymus. So this you'll have on your lab exam. There's the thymus, and again, it sits right above the heart. So here's your heart. And it's sitting right in front of those major blood vessels like the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Next, we have the spleen. The adult spleen contains the largest collection of lymphoid tissues. In the whole body. So what the spleen's going to do is it's going to remove abnormal cells. It also removes blood components. So when red blood cells, white blood cells are being recycled, then the spleen will remove them from circulation, will remove the blood components from circulation. It's going to do this because it contains cells that will phagocytize those abnormal cells and those blood components. The spleen also stores iron. So after red blood cells are, after they burst, after they've lived 120 days and they die, then the iron from the heme groups will be stored in the spleen. And then lastly, what the spleen does is it initiates the immune response. So there's a lot of B cells and T cells in the spleen. And when the spleen becomes notified of an infection or invading pathogens in the body, the spleen will be the location where T cells and B cells become activated against that specific pathogen. This is a picture showing the spleen. So if we look at him in this man, you can see the stomach right here, and the spleen then sits right behind that stomach. If we were to take a look at this picture here, this is the front of the body on this side. This is the back of the body right here. And this is your left side. And so this is the stomach, and sitting right behind the stomach then we have the spleen. Here's a picture of the spleen. It's showing the area where blood vessels, the arteries and veins are entering and exiting, as well as the lymphatic vessel. And always in an organ, when we see that, we call that area of the organ the hilum. Okay, this ends our first video on the lymphatic system. In the second video, we're going to talk about the body defenses. So we'll look at non-specific defenses, otherwise known as innate defenses, and then we're going to look at specific defenses, otherwise known as acquired defenses. So we'll see you in the next video.